start over. I'd like to speak with you this morning about a subject I've been thinking about a great deal over the last while, and one that I know that many people in this congregation have been hoping that I will address. And I'm referring, of course, to the 2022 film Jackass Forever. Is this a crowd that's familiar with the Jackass series of movies? And okay, so some people are underprivileged here in this environment. So starting around the turn of the century, on music television, popularly known as MTV, a group of young folks, young men, got together to do misguided stunts and pranks. And in the course of which they were regularly injured or would push the limits of social norms or both, and it would end in hilarity. And more recent, after the show ended, I didn't watch. I wasn't aware of it when it was first around 25 years ago. It subsequently became a film series, culminating most recently in the aforementioned Jackass Forever. And I got to see the most recent film in the cinema. And I guess people go to movies like this. I went to a film like this for the same reason that you go to see horror movies and to go on roller coasters or to hear from comics who kind of push the limits of what you're allowed to say out loud. It's a way of entering into peril without actually being in danger. So it's thrilling without actually putting yourself at risk. And I was glad to see the most recent one in the cinema because I was there with other people, and like watching a horror movie, there was actually a moment straight out of a Hitchcock film when someone sitting beside me looked at the screen and said, "Oh no," and which is like, oh, that's wonderful to kind of have that collective experience. But as I went home, and as I reflected on the film afterwards, I thought, oh, there's something more going on here than simply being like thrilling and a little transgressive. There's actually something of the gospel about this movie. Okay, bear with me here. And I've been ruminating on that ever since. And I want to suggest that in this series of films, there's three themes which we hear in the gospel. There's an emphasis on abiding friendship. There is an emphasis on the fundamental goodness of the body. And there is an emphasis on the joy of making mistakes. And I want to spend some time with each of these ideas with you this morning and wonder what they might have to teach us about church and about how we encounter Scripture. So abiding friendship. It's now a quarter of a century into the new millennium. It's been a long time since Jackass premiered around the year 2000, and the cast is now decidedly middle-aged in nature. They're no longer young men. And as a consequence, they have all this stuff that comes with getting older. One of their number has died in a car accident. Another of their number is deep into alcoholism and other substance abuse, and their bodies just don't work the way that they used to. Their knees hurt more, they're not as flexible as they once were. They have all these complaints that build as life goes on. And perhaps because of this massive shared history, I watched this film and said, oh, this is a movie about people who love each other. Now, they express this love in an incredibly sophomoric fashion with these pranks and giggling, but the love remains. They have all these things that they have shared and done together and endured together and celebrated together, and there is a profound holy friendship that flows out of that. I think about when we do a funeral or a wedding, the stories that we want to tell when someone comes up to the microphone to make a remembrance. And how often those are stories of things folks have endured, things going wrong. Maybe I'm anticipating here the joy of making mistakes, things going off of the script, and how together, remember the time with Uncle Mike when we got lost in the woods and this grand adventure ensued. These are the stories that we want to tell in these holy moments, and they are the glue of friendship. I like to think that this is what John and James and Jesus and the other disciples have, this abiding friendship that flows out of shared experience. And dare we say, like the people in Jackass Forever, not just a friendship, but a friendship that is joyous and rooted even in hilarity. Thanks to oil paintings, we don't think of Jesus laughing all that often. He tends to look super serious in paintings. But I am deeply drawn to the idea that he and James and John and Peter and the rest of them, Mary and the others, laugh regularly and uproariously, especially when things go wrong. Remember that time when you were telling the Beatitudes and this guy totally misheard you or started talking back or fell down or who knows what. And those are the stories that they tell and roar around the campfire. So abiding friendship. What if that is what we are called to in church? What if that is what the kingdom looks like? Second, the fundamental goodness of the body. It's weird that the Christian tradition, that parts of the Christian tradition have this suspicion of the body, are afraid of the body, and are afraid of sexuality in particular. This should be the last tradition that is suspicious of the body. Our text begins, the Bible begins with God creating human beings, looking on the body and saying, this is very good. And then Jesus, God himself, becomes human, spends 30 or 33 years in a body. It's good to be alive. It's good to have arms and legs, to move through the world, to delight in food, to enjoy sleeping, to enjoy swimming in the ocean, you name it. It's good even when our bodies don't work as we expected. There's a life hack in the Jackass movies that I so wish I had known at age 13 or age 16. And that is when your body does something spectacular and unexpected, that's not humiliating, that's hilarious. Imagine if you'd known that in high school. Like, that would be so freeing to have that information. And it seems to me, I was reflecting on this, it seems to me the wise people I have known in my life have understood this deeply. Phoebe's late grandmother, who became my grandmother, one of just the kindest and wisest and most faithful people I ever knew, got to be very old. And in her old age, she was losing weight, the way people do sometimes when they are elderly. And she told the story of going to a very public place. Do you remember, was it a bank or like a supermarket? We're gonna go for a bank, because I'm not positive. She was in a very public place, surrounded by a lot of people in a bank, and because she had lost weight, her hips no longer had the capacity to hold up her skirt in the way that they once did. And so from one moment to the next, she is surrounded by all these people in the bank, and suddenly her skirt is down on the floor around her ankles. And she told this story and said, thankfully I was wearing a slip. And then she howled with laughter. That was not humiliating. It was hilarious. And what a wonderful piece of news. Like, even as we age and change, our bodies are still good. They are still what allow us to participate fully in this life. Shannon in the choir, we were talking about aging, because that's what we do, a while back, and Shannon was saying, like, imagine this, I'm not going to put it as articulately as you did, but there's the spiritual lessons that are just built into having a body and aging. You're invited into humility, you are invited into patience. If you get the gift of being old, it just doesn't work in the way that it once does. And that is a gift and a discovery. Even if you're one of the younger people here, even if you're 16, your body is different and doesn't do the things that it once did. And there are lessons in this. The body is good. One of my sort of saddest memories of my childhood, my immediate neighbor, Mrs. Henderson, as she declined, she became a wheelchair user, and she stopped leaving her house because she didn't want people to see her in the wheelchair. And I really feel this surge of sadness remembering that. What would we have learned if we had seen? We would have learned that aging existed, and that aging existed for her. I'm even in what was the end of her life, the last few years of her life, her body was good, and I wish that was something that she could have heard and known. I like to think that Jesus and his friends are delighting in having bodies. They're doing all of this walking. If you've been to the Holy Land and traveled around, a thing that's almost impossible not to think about is how much time Jesus and his friends spent walking from one place to another. And in the scene, you can imagine, if you've done a lot of walking, you can imagine the blisters on their feet. You can imagine their digestive systems are not necessarily working the way they do when they're stationary. You can imagine the sweat of being on the road, and yet this delight in being alive and moving through the world. Thanks be to God for that. So one more, the joy of mistakes. So I don't know why I've been thinking about this film quite as much as I have been. I recently brought it up at a party. Last week was Canadian Thanksgiving. In Canada, Thanksgiving falls earlier. It's more of a harvest festival, I guess, than it is here. And a group of folks with Canadian connections gather every year to celebrate. And I was chatting with a friend there about Jackass Forever, and I named the first two things I had named. I said, I love that this movie is about abiding friendship. I love that this movie is about the goodness of having a body. And she immediately said, oh yes, and it's about the joy of things going wrong. It's about how interesting mistakes are. And I thought, oh man, like I hadn't thought of that, but that's totally right. The stunts these folks come up with are pretty good when they work, but they are excellent when they go wrong. Like that's when the movie gets exciting. That is when the movie gets funny. That is when you connect with them, is when there is some spectacular mistake. And that's so real, isn't it? I think it's Elie Wiesel who said that God made human beings because God loves stories. And there's no story until there's a mistake. There's no story until there's a problem or a conflict in nature. My youngest son and I are reading Lord of the Rings at home immensely. It's just as good, like the fifth time. How is that possible? And I was reflecting, listening to it, like Frodo stays in the Shire and enjoys food and friendship is beautiful, but that's actually not a story. You need the Dark Riders to show up. You need the antagonist if you're going to have a story. And similarly, you need the mistakes if we are going to have a story, if we're going to grow and learn. What if things going wrong is an invitation to discovery, to delight, to connection, to learning? How many of you have learned via mistake, have had an important mistake in your life, and something beautiful and new has flowed out of that? Even church is a place where we can make holy and good mistakes. I'm struck when we go to coffee hour how many of our stories are about things going beautifully wrong. The roof leaking, or I understand we've talked a little bit about the dishwasher, or the, what's the origin story of our sit-down meal at one point called the Friday Feed? Hale McMahon and others have this idea that they're going to do a meal that anyone can come to it. It'll be like the feeding miracles of Jesus, right? Anyone can come. And so they prepare food and they set the table, and it's beautiful, except there's no guests whatsoever to it. And so Hale, I just love this origin story. Gets on his bike. I've told this many times. It's a family story, isn't it? Here at Grace, you've told this story many times. Gets on his bicycle and proceeds to tour through Sullivan's Gulch in Irvington and the Lloyd District, finding folks who would like to come to dinner. That story's beautiful because of the thing that goes wrong. We have a reputation, Episcopalians, sometimes of being stuck or stodgy or in our ways. There's, what is that joke? We're the frozen chosen. But I have on my bookshelf a book from the 1960s. Like, it's an official Episcopal book called the Experimental Liturgy Book. There was this permission, at least in that season, to try stuff out. And if it went wrong, it was okay. If there was a mistake, you could look at the liturgy being the ancient Greek word for what we're doing right now for worship, and say, oh, we want to learn from that. There was a really instructive error that we just had. We're going to learn from that and build upon that. I like to think that that's part of what Jesus and John and James and Peter and the others are sharing, that it is okay to make a mistake. It's okay to ask the wrong question. Last week, there was something in the gospel that I was just so struck by. This young rich man comes to Jesus and says, look, what do I have to do to inherit eternal life? And it turns out he's already got the answer right, but he makes this mistake, and he keeps pressing, and he says, I already love God, I already love my neighbor, what else? He's pressing into this mistaken, dangerous territory, and having made this mistake, Jesus says the most extraordinary thing. Do you remember it from last week? He says, the text says, Jesus loved him. Isn't that amazing? When you get things wrong, I think we could put that anywhere in the gospel. When we come to Jesus and say, hey, I realize what the kingdom is me becoming as powerful as possible and as rich as possible and having as much status as possible. How do I sit on your right hand and on your left? A total misunderstanding of what the kingdom is. And I think after this, we could insert these words, and Jesus loved them. That is always Jesus' response to error. Because these mistakes, this mistaken understanding of what the kingdom is, what it is to say yes to the gospel, these mistakes are an invitation to learn, to go further, to understand even more. By getting it wrong, we have an opportunity not to get it right or perfect, but to get it better. So 3 wonderings for you this morning. We've heard about the gospel of Mark and Luke and John. A wondering this morning about, dare we say, the gospel of Jackass. What would that be like? An invitation into abiding friendship, an invitation into remembering the deep goodness of the body, and an invitation to celebrate the, what should we say, the fecundity of mistakes. How many beautiful things are waiting and getting things wrong. Maybe in these three things, we may take a step further into love and connection, a step further into the kingdom.